In the summer of 1887, a young ethnographer working for the Bureau of American Ethnology entered the mountains of western North Carolina and began asking Cherokee people what they knew about the land around them. His name was James Mooney. Over the following years, he recorded stories, sacred formulas, place names, historical memories, ceremonies, and details of Cherokee life that would eventually fill hundreds of pages. But among those records was something unusually specific. The Cherokee told him about another population in the mountains, not animals, not the spirits of people who had died. A separate class of beings known as the Nûñnɇ�. Mooney translated the name as the Immortals and described them as spirit people. According to the accounts he collected, they could look exactly like ordinary Cherokee when they wanted to be seen. They had leaders, they had communities, they danced, they helped lost travelers, and they lived inside the mountains. Not inside some vague mythical mountain far beyond the known world. Mooney's informants named places: Pilot Knob in North Carolina, Blood Mountain in Georgia, the ancient mound at Nikwasi in what is now Franklin, and other ridges and waterways across the old Cherokee highlands. Hunters were said to hear drums and dancing from inside solid mountains, only for the sound to move when they tried to locate its source. At Nikwasi, the story became stranger. The mound supposedly opened during an attack, and hundreds of Nûñnɇ� warriors came out to defend the town. When the fighting ended, they went back inside. The mound is still there, and James Mooney's record is still there too. So this is not a story about proving that immortal people literally inhabit the Appalachian Mountains. The question is more interesting than that. Why did Cherokee tradition attach these beings to real, named locations so consistently? What did those mountains mean to the people who lived among them for generations? And when an oral tradition describes an invisible population occupying a second geography beneath a familiar landscape, what exactly are we supposed to do with it? Before we get into the oldest accounts, if you come here for the original records behind stories like this, not just the version that survives on the internet, consider subscribing, because in this case, the source is sitting in plain sight. It was published by the United States government more than a century ago, and the original text is stranger than most of the modern retellings. James Mooney was not born into academia. Smithsonian records describe him as a self-taught ethnographer. He joined the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1885 and made his first extended field trip among the eastern Cherokee 2 years later. During that first summer in the Great Smoky Mountains region, he studied language, collected cultural material, observed ceremonies and games, and began building relationships that would continue for years. His Cherokee work eventually became one of the major documentary records of the community during a period when older knowledge was disappearing under enormous outside pressure. That does not mean everything Mooney wrote should automatically be treated as literal fact. He was still an outsider. He worked within the assumptions of 19th century anthropology. Some Cherokee knowledge remained private, and Smithsonian archives today acknowledge that portions of his Cherokee materials remain culturally sensitive. But there is an important difference between Mooney inventing a story and Mooney documenting that a story was being told. When he believed something was tradition, he generally presented it as tradition. When he knew an informant, he sometimes named that person. And when a story belonged to a particular place, he often recorded the place. That last detail is what matters here. Mooney's section on the Nûñnɇ� begins almost like an ethnographic description of a neighboring community. He calls them the Immortals and says they inhabited the highlands of the old Cherokee country. Their homes were associated especially with high mountains. Mooney says they had large gathering places at Pilot Knob, beneath the old Nikwasi Mound, and beneath Blood Mountain near the headwaters of the Nûñnɇ� River. They were usually invisible, but invisibility was not described as their permanent physical condition. They could choose to become visible, and when they did, according to the tradition, they looked and spoke like other Cherokee people. That distinction is easy to miss. The Nûñnɇ� were not described as grotesque monsters waiting in caves. They occupied a neighboring world that overlapped with the human one. People encountered them unexpectedly. A traveler became lost. A hunter heard music. Someone followed a stranger. Then, briefly, the hidden landscape became visible. Mooney also separated the Nûñnɇ� from another better-known category in Cherokee tradition, the Yunwi Tsunsti, usually rendered in English as the Little People. He did not treat the two as interchangeable. The Little People were described as small beings. The Nûñnɇ� were not. In the accounts Mooney collected, the Immortals could pass for ordinary people. That matters because modern retellings sometimes collapse every unusual Cherokee being into a single category. The source does not. The old accounts are more organized than that. Different beings occupy different places and behave in different ways. And the Nûñnɇ� are defined less by their appearance than by where they live, inside the highlands. One account Mooney preserved came through a man named Wofford. Wofford had heard the story repeatedly, but eventually asked an older man from Nûñnɇ� to describe what had happened to him when he was a boy. The man said he had been perhaps 10 or 12 years old. He was near the river when a stranger approached and invited him to come home for dinner. The boy followed. What happened next does not sound like entering a dark cave. He arrived at a normal-looking settlement. There were a house. There were people. There were children. He ate with them, played, slept there overnight, and the next morning was given directions back toward his own home. Then, after walking a short distance, he turned around. Everything was gone. The house, the field, the orchard, the fence. There were only trees on the mountainside. When the boy finally returned home, people had already been searching for him. From his perspective, he had simply spent the night with another family. From theirs, he had disappeared. Mooney did not tell the reader what caused the experience. He simply preserved the account. That kind of story is important because it establishes the rules of the tradition. The hidden world was not necessarily deep underground in the way we imagine a mine shaft. The boundary could apparently open and close. A mountainside could contain a settlement that disappeared when the visitor crossed back out. At other locations, the boundary was experienced through sound. Mooney recorded that hunters sometimes heard singing and drums from what seemed to be a gathering inside a mountain. When they moved toward the sound, it seemed to shift somewhere else. No doorway appeared. No village could be located. Just rock. The obvious modern response is to search for a physical explanation. Sound behaves strangely in mountains. Wind, valleys, and rock faces can redirect noise. There may have been other settlements beyond a ridge that the listener could not see. Those possibilities are reasonable, but they do not explain why Cherokee tradition organized the experiences into a consistent category of people with their own name, social identity, and associated locations. The interesting thing is not a single sound heard at night. It is the system built around it, and some of those locations are remarkably specific. At Blood Mountain, Mooney recorded a tradition that the Nûñnɇ� maintained a townhouse beneath the mountain, near one upper branch of the Nûñnɇ� River. He also described a small opening in the ground where warm vapor reportedly rose into the air. Hunters sometimes stopped near it during cold weather because of the warmth. According to the traditional explanation Mooney recorded, the heat came from the fire of a Nûñnɇ� townhouse beneath the mountain. That is not geological proof of an underground settlement. Warm air moving from an opening in rock can have ordinary natural explanations. But again, Mooney's record attaches the story to a particular feature in a particular landscape. The story had coordinates before anyone used that word for it. There is even a place on the Oconaluftee River that Mooney identified as associated with the Nûñnɇ�. He recorded Nûñnɇ�, a ridge below what was then called Yellow Hill in Swain County, as a place connected with these beings. That brings the geography close to the heart of the modern Cherokee homeland and the Smokies. Today, the eastern band of Cherokee Indians remains deeply connected to the Southern Appalachian landscape, including the lands now contained within Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The National Park Service itself acknowledges those ancestral connections. So when we talk about Cherokee stories from the Smoky Mountains, we need to be precise. The landscape in Mooney's record is larger than today's national park boundary. It stretches through western North Carolina, northern Georgia, and the surrounding Cherokee Highlands. The modern park came later. The stories belong to an older map. The strongest Nûñnɇ story Mooney recorded, though, is not about a hunter hearing drums. It is about a town facing destruction. Nikwasi stood along the Little Tennessee River in what is now Franklin, North Carolina. The town was an important Cherokee ceremonial center. Its mound still rises today in the middle of the modern city. Archaeological and historical work places construction of the mound roughly 1,000 years ago, although occupation and use of the larger landscape spans a much longer history. The mound supported a Cherokee townhouse and stood at the center of a substantial settlement. So this part of the story begins with a physical place, not a vanished one. You can stand beside it today. According to the account Mooney recorded, an unknown enemy force entered Cherokee country from the southeast. Settlement after settlement was attacked. Eventually, the invaders approached Nikwasi. The people gathered their families in the townhouse, while the warriors prepared to defend the town. The battle went badly. The Nikwasi defenders began falling back. Then, a stranger appeared. He told the chief to withdraw his warriors and let him handle what was coming. The Cherokee initially assumed that reinforcements had arrived from another settlement. Then they saw where the warriors were coming from. The site of the mound opened. A large force emerged. Mooney's account identifies them as the Nûñnɇ. Once outside, they became invisible to the attacking force. The enemy could see weapons moving and could feel the blows, but could not see who was striking them. The attackers were defeated. And afterward, the Nûñnɇ returned to the mound. There is no archaeological evidence that hundreds of immortal warriors physically emerged from Nikwasi. That needs to be said clearly. Modern archaeology interprets Nikwasi as a native platform mound built and modified across generations. Ground-penetrating radar has identified different construction stages and buried portions of the mound. It has not revealed a giant hollow chamber containing an invisible settlement. And archaeology at Nikwasi has been deliberately limited. The site is culturally important. It is not an abandoned puzzle waiting for outsiders to dig through it. That restraint matters. In fact, the history of attempts to investigate Nikwasi adds an unexpected detail. In 1889, while Mooney was conducting his Cherokee research, he sought permission connected with archaeological investigation of the mound. The mound was not opened during the Bureau of American Ethnology's large mound exploration program. Later, archaeological work around it remained extremely limited. A non-invasive ground-penetrating radar survey conducted more than a century later indicated multiple construction stages and substantial buried portions of the site. Nearby work has also shown that large areas of the original Cherokee town surface remain protected beneath later fill. So when someone says, why don't they simply dig into the mound and see what's there? The answer is not mysterious. It is a protected ancestral Cherokee cultural site containing archaeology, history, and potentially burials. Excavating it simply to test a supernatural story would itself create a serious cultural problem. The mound's modern history makes that even clearer. For generations after Cherokee land loss, Nikwasi remained separated from direct Cherokee control. Local preservation efforts protected it physically, but debates over stewardship continued. The Nûñnɇ initiative was eventually created through collaboration involving Eastern Band members and regional partners. And in 2026, The organization announced that work was moving forward toward returning the mound property to the eastern band of Cherokee Indians. The site is not merely an archaeological object. It is part of a living relationship with a people who never stopped considering that landscape home. That context changes how the Nûñnɇ story should be heard. It is tempting to turn it into a cryptid investigation. Are there hidden people physically living underneath the mountain? Is there a cave entrance somewhere? Could radar find them? Those are modern questions. They may not be the questions the tradition was built to answer. Mooney's accounts repeatedly describe the Nûñnɇ as protectors. They rescue lost travelers. They provide refuge. They defend Cherokee towns. And in another group of stories, they invite Cherokee communities to leave the visible world and join them. Those accounts become much heavier when placed against Cherokee history. In one tradition, voices warn people living along the valley and Hiwassee rivers that wars and misfortune are coming. The people are told that they can join the Immortals. They must enter the townhouse, fast, and remain silent for 7 days. At the end of that period, the Nûñnɇ arrive. In one version, a townhouse and its people are carried toward a mountain and transformed into stone. In another, people living near Hiwassee are taken beneath the water. The tradition says that their relatives could sometimes hear them below the surface. Mooney then adds one historical observation of his own. When Cherokee communities from those regions were forcibly removed west in 1838, some remembered with regret the relatives who, according to tradition, had already gone to live with the Nûñnɇ. I would be very careful about calling that a supernatural prediction of the Trail of Tears. Mooney does not give us enough evidence to make that claim. Stories change. Old traditions absorb new historical pain, and accounts recorded after an event can acquire meaning from what people have lived through. But the emotional structure is difficult to miss. A hidden people inside the mountains offer refuge. Those who go with them remain in their homeland. Those who remain in the visible world eventually face war, displacement, and removal. Whether that relationship developed before or after the trauma of removal, the story preserves something historically real. The possibility of staying when the outside world is forcing you to leave. The mountains become more than scenery. They become a place the invader cannot reach. The Nûñnɇ inhabit the part of the homeland that cannot be surrendered on paper. That is an interpretation, not something Mooney himself proves, but it may explain why reducing these accounts to fairy stories misses so much of what they carry. The Nûñnɇ are tied to place, and place was exactly what Cherokee communities were being forced to lose. There is one more Mooney record worth mentioning because it shows how careful we need to be with modern interpretations. Near Little Snowbird Creek in Graham County, Mooney recorded a place name meaning roughly where he alighted. The explanation attached to it described a mysterious being with the form of a giant and a head blazing like the sun. According to the account, it flew through the air, descended onto the mountain, remained there briefly, and then flew away. When people later examined the place, the vegetation where it had stood was said to have been burned. Mooney adds that the Cherokee did not know what the being was. Some thought it might have been the sun. Read that today, and the temptation is immediate. A flying object, a landing, burned ground. Call it a UFO. Connect it to the people inside the mountains, build one enormous theory. But the original source does not do that. Mooney does not connect the luminous giant to the Nûñnɇ. The Cherokee explanation he recorded does not connect them either. They are separate pieces of place-based tradition, and preserving that separation actually makes the material more interesting. because it shows that the Cherokee landscape Mooney documented was full of individually named places with their own histories. A ridge was not simply a ridge. A mountain could have a remembered event. A river bend could have a story. A mound could hold the memory of protection. A bald spot on a mountainside could preserve the place where something extraordinary was believed to have descended. Mooney was recording a cultural geography, not collecting random monsters. And that may be the most important clue to understanding what the Cherokee said was living inside these mountains. There is no archaeological evidence for a hidden biological population of immortal humans beneath the Southern Appalachians. There is no confirmed underground Nûñnɇ� city inside Pilot Knob. No excavation has produced the warriors described at Nikwasi. No scientific survey has established that the dancing herd inside mountains came from a physical settlement behind the rock. Those claims remain within tradition, but the tradition itself is real. The record exists. The names exist. The places exist. And in several cases, the landscapes still carry enormous significance for Cherokee people today. That is enough to make the story worth taking seriously without pretending we have proven something we have not. The Eastern Band's relationship with the Great Smoky Mountains did not begin when the national park was created. The National Park Service acknowledges Cherokee ancestral connection to the region stretching back thousands of years. Even Kuwohi, the highest peak in the Smokies, had its Cherokee name formally restored in 2024 after generations under the name Klingman's Dome. The landscape is slowly recovering names that outsiders once replaced. Perhaps that should make us think differently about the stories attached to those names too. When James Mooney entered western North Carolina in 1887, he did something simple. He asked people who already knew the mountains what the mountains meant. The answers he received were not geological surveys. They were not maps in the modern scientific sense, but they were maps of another kind. Pilot Knob had inhabitants. Blood Mountain had a hidden gathering place. A ridge near the Oconaluftee was associated with the Immortals. Nikwasi was protected from within. Waterways held relatives who had crossed into another existence, and certain mountains could briefly open onto a world that disappeared when the visitor looked back. You do not have to believe those places physically contain immortal people to understand how specific that geography is. That is the part I find hardest to dismiss. Not the supernatural explanation, the precision of the memory. For generation after generation, the stories kept returning to particular pieces of land. And more than a century after Mooney wrote them down, many of those places remain exactly where the elders said they were. The stone is still there. The rivers are still there. Nikwasi Mound is still there. What lies inside the mountain is another question entirely. Maybe the Nûñnɇ� belonged to a spiritual understanding of the landscape that outsiders were never meant to convert into literal archaeology. Maybe some accounts preserve memories of people, shelters, or communities whose original historical context has been lost. Maybe the answer is not something modern categories can separate cleanly into history or myth. Mooney did not solve that problem. Neither can we. But he left something extremely valuable behind. A record of what Cherokee people told him before the internet, before UFO culture, before Bigfoot television shows, and before the Smoky Mountains became primarily a tourist destination in the American imagination. And what they told him was remarkably consistent on one point. The mountains were not empty. So I want to leave you with one question. When an oral tradition does not simply describe mysterious beings, but attaches them to named mountains, rivers, and a mound that still stands, how much historical weight should we give that memory? Tell me where you land in the comments, and if you come back for investigations where indigenous memory, old records, and real American landscapes intersect, subscribe. Because sometimes the strangest part of an old story is not what it says was hidden. It is how precisely it tells you where to look.